Twilight mean it's time? It does, okay. Obviously, am I too loud? Is this all right? Okay. Obviously, I'm not Frank. Frank is out of town with visiting family for the holidays, and he asked me would I do this particular time, and I said I would. I'm always grateful for the opportunity to do this sort of thing. To be allowed to speak about God's Word is a privilege, and so I thank him for that. His series this particular quarter, and as best I can tell next quarter as well, is Never Quit, Never Give Up. So I wanted to talk, he said talk about anything you want to, but I thought maybe it's better if we stay with that line of logic. And in that line of logic, I chose a series out of Matthew, Walking on Water. So we're going to talk about that. And there's actually two parts to the time when Jesus is walking on water. And we'll do the first part, and then I have something extra I want to do with the time that he actually spends with Peter walking on water. I don't know whose flowers these are. They may have come from Ron. Ron Waddell and I were and are buddies. I used to call him my buddy, and we sat pretty much together at our assigned seats over there. But having that thought brought to mind something that this lesson is sort of about for me, and that is understanding the processes of life help you to understand what occurs. And if you can understand that and you can follow that, and you have the faith to follow that, then that relieves stress, which relieves fear, which makes you understand why you never gave up, why you never give up, why you never quit, what the logic is behind that. In that light, I told my wife, I said, I'm a little bit jealous of Ron Waddell. And she looked at me, really? And I said, yes, Ron now understands the piece of passes that we don't understand. He's there. He's got it. And I'm not there yet. I still got some struggles to go through. That didn't sit all that well with her. To her, it was interpreted, you don't want to be here with me? No, that's not the case. But that's kind of the way this reading goes to me. So let's talk about it just a little bit. It's Matthew 14 if you want to follow along. Verse 23. Now to set this up just a little bit, where we are right now is we're after the feeding of the 5,000. Or actually that's 15 or 20,000. And at that point, he's at the north end of the lake, or he goes to the north end of the lake, when John the Baptist's followers come to him and they say, John has been beheaded. After they had taken John's body and buried it, then they come and tell Jesus, and he goes to up around the north end of the lake, and that's where he feeds the 5,000, or the 15 to 20,000. And after that, it's kind of interesting how he starts this. And I think the reason I wanted to say something about how we got here is because the language is a little bit unusual. It says he made them get into the boat. And I started looking at that. It's an order. Y'all get in the boat, go across. And I'm not gonna do that with you. It's almost like Herod did this, and I could get y'all in trouble. So you get in the boat, you go that way, I'm gonna dismiss the crowds, and I'm gonna stay at the north end of the lake for a little while. He uses another word, and I know this may not seem odd to you. It's not odd, but it's a little bit different. The Greek word that he uses for he went there to pray The only other time I know that that word is used, and I could be wrong, y'all could correct me, but the only time I know that that word is used is at Gethsemane. Every other time it's communication, talk, that sort of thing. So he's going up to the north end of the lake, and when he sends them off, he sends them to go to the other side of the lake. Now, the lake itself is the source of the lake is the Jordan River, but it also has a number of underground streams that feed it. It is one of the largest completely freshwater lakes that meet this description in the world. It is several hundred feet below sea level, and it is 13, 14 miles long from north to south and roughly 8 miles wide from east to west, and it gets to a depth of 140 feet. It is all fresh water, and it made the fishing wonderful. So from the north end of the lake at this time, there's a lot of fishermen. And that has kind of built back up to that. When they get in the boat to row from where they are across the lake, it's probably about 5 miles, something in that neighborhood. And when the problems start, they're at about 3.5 miles of that. Now then, let's just read that for a minute. Right then, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side of the lake while he dismissed the crowds. When he sent them away, he went up into the mountain by himself to pray. Evening came, and he was alone. Meanwhile, the boat, fighting a strong headwind, was being battered by the waves and was already far away from land. Very early in the morning, he came to his disciples, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." Jesus then spoke to them, "Be encouraged, it is me, do not be afraid." Peter replied, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Then Peter got out of the boat and was walking on the water toward Jesus. But when Peter was in the strong wind, he became frightened, and he began to sink, and he shouted, "Lord, rescue me." Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him, saying, "You man of weak faith, why did you begin to have doubts?" When they got him into the boat, the wind settled, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You are the Son of God." Now, where Jesus is, this is a picture, this is a current picture of the north end of the lake. And they're going to go from about right here across over to here. And the lake is a bowl, and it is well below sea level, and these mountains surround the outside of the lake. The Bible mentions that about the term they use, the term that would have been used for what the Bible says is it's about the second twilight. Now that's the time in between twilight and plain dark, and he is walking through this area of the lake. Okay? Now from here he can see directly into the lake. He can watch the boat. What happens is these hills through here, if the wind gets up at all, it whips over the top of the hills and down across the lake. So it doesn't require a great big storm to bring waves 3 feet, 6 feet's not unusual, and it can come up all of a sudden because of the way the wind comes over the hill and whips down through the valley. And that appears to be what has happened. The wind has gotten up. This is that twilight time that we're talking about, and this is what he could see from the mountains looking down into the lake. This is what it would look like in that area in the daytime. And this is one of the cities that's kind of a fishing village built along the lake. Okay, I want to talk about a couple of things first. Now, I'd a whole lot rather this be a discussion than me sit here and talk about it. What would you say? Well, I shouldn't have shown you the disc, should I? What would you say that Jesus was watching? If you accept the premise, and that's my premise, the Bible doesn't say he was walking at the top of the lake watching, but if you're walking at the top of the lake and you look down on the lake, and keep in mind that it's Passover, which is almost always associated with the full moon. So the waves start. He's walking and he's watching. What is he watching? Why is he watching? Here's what he's doing. And this is an analogy. Most of these stories, aside from being a truthful story, they're intended to be analogies for how we deal with life and what we can expect from the difficulties of life. What he's watching is the wind get up and the storm. And the wind comes down over the valley and it starts a storm. And they've gone what the Bible says is a good distance. It's about 3.5 miles that they have rowed, but they have about another mile to go. And he is watching the winds buffet the boat. And he sees that they're in trouble. He watches what's happening to them. Now keep in mind that John is one of the people in the boat, and he's a fisherman, big strong hands. And if you think in your mind, you can hear the one small wave there, one small sail that they have beating the side of the boat. And they have rowed this distance. When Jesus walks on the water, the Bible says it is, by Roman measure, the fourth period of the night, which is 3 to 6 a.m. Now, he's been watching since it was twilight. So he's been walking and watching, walking and watching. And what are some of the things that he did? And the story that I can give you best for me is I remember sitting on the side of the pool watching one of my daughters learn to swim. And she would get in the water and try to swim. And her head would go into the water and she'd panic. And the guy teaching her would help her get back up. And she'd go and try again. What I can remember is saying, boy, I wish I could just get in there and stop this. But then what would have happened if I had done that? She wouldn't know how to swim. He's watching them and he's observing what's occurring. He's observing their choices, observing their difficulties. And while he came there to pray, he has not forgotten them. And I think that's our lesson from what Jesus watches. It's our lesson for us today. He's watching. He can't necessarily take away the difficulties. But if you're right in your faith, you understand that he is still there. He is still watching. What is the second thing that he does? Let's see if I made another note. I said that he hadn't forgotten them and he had not given up on them. Well, he also didn't do some other things. What did I put up here? He didn't immediately calm the storm, and he didn't take away the fear that was there. Now, why not? I mean, he obviously knew that, I'm fixing to walk out on the water. But why not take that away? What did they gain through this adversity? The Bible ends up by saying, and when he got in the boat, they worshiped him. So what kind of strength did they gain by facing this difficulty? Strength in their faith, right? They knew how to be stronger. They knew how to face the storms in this life. And everybody has storms in their life. There's not a way in the world to get around it. It can be a problem with a relationship. It can be a problem with you losing somebody. It can be financial difficulties. We all deal with some difficulties. The reading that I do says that if you stand up in front of a normal church, 50% of the people sitting there are either starting into a difficulty or just coming out of one. So if we're ordinary, half of us here are having a problem right now. And what he's trying to show here is how you gather strength where you stand and the choices that you make. So he doesn't calm their fears. He knows they're tired. And after he watches, what does he do? He comes. He comes to him. Now what's he going to do when he comes to him? Well, he's going to fix the problem, obviously. But what does he require of them? He walks on the water and they say, he's a ghost. So they don't recognize him. The first thing they have to do is say, yeah, I know who this is. I know what he can do. I know what he will do. I know what he's able to do. And while it might not be right this second, it's always what he's going to be able to do. It took their faith to another level when they recognized him, when they said, if it's you, then do this. They ask him for something in return. So what does he do? Tells Peter, fine, it's me, get out of the boat and walk. And as soon as they get back in the boat, of course we're going to talk about Peter's problem in a minute, but as soon as they get back in the boat, their problems are solved. Now, so what was required? What was required is recognition and their faith that he was who he was. What's required today of us? How is it any different? It's not. And that's why I'm saying this story is an analogy about why you never quit, why you never give up, why you know that in life we're not promised a ride that don't include waves and storms and difficulties, but what we are promised is a safe landing. And that's what's coming out of this story. That's the analogy that's coming from here. Or at least it is to me. Now, if you see something else, I wish you'd interrupt me. This is supposed to be a conversation. Okay. All right. And when he comes, what does he do? Well, he calms the sea, right? He helped. Now, one of the things that the Bible says here is that they were alone, and he took notice of that. There are more than one way. There's more than one way in life to be alone. You can be truly alone. But, you know, something I heard Nick Saban say this morning, which Nick Saban is the gospel this morning, right? He wins by 2 points and that's it. Yeah. But something he said this morning is, you know, the group got together. We won as a group. And I thought to myself, you know, that's what this is saying. That I wrote a paper one time in graduate school on why did this church survive the first century, because we shouldn't have. And what my end result, and I had a genius professor that I thought I'd probably fail the class, I came to 50 type pages basically to say one thing, This was the first time in history that a large group of people had been told, it's your job to take care of each other. It's your job to be a group. Your church is designed for the purpose of you taking care of each other when the storms of life come. That's what we're supposed to do. And that was my purpose in the paper. I said, that's why the church survives. It's why it survives then, and it's why it survives now. In the first century, if you were a farmer and you lost your crop, there was nobody to take care of you. I researched back 1,000 years or so before the first century, and there were virtually no social programs. If your crop failed and you were a farmer, you could sell yourself into slavery. Or you could go on the street as a beggar, or you could starve to death. There wasn't anybody going to help you with it, for the most part. And then along comes Jesus, and he says, there's a whole group of people here, and they're all going to take care of you when it's your turn. And in my judgment, that's the command that we have today, and it's what comes out of this boat. Loneliness is a particular term. If you lose someone you love, that is probably one of the most lonely times you'll ever have in your life. And it is a difficulty that you have no choice but to walk alone. You are alone when you walk that path. Here's what you're not. If a person cares enough for you to say, you got to walk the path, but you don't have to walk it by yourself. They've told you two things. They've told you that you matter enough to be heard, and they've told you that, no, you're not alone. Yeah, you got to take the steps, but I'm here to take them with you. And that's what he's talking about here. They feel like they're alone, and they find out that they're not. Okay, the last thing there was they took him into the boat. Now, what's the analogy there? Before the troubles passed, they took him into the boat. What's the analogy for us? Before the storms are past, they took him into the boat. What about our lives? Before we conquer this life, we take him into the boat. He's part of it. He's part of the walk. He's part of the one that's going to take care of the issue of loneliness. Yeah, you got to walk this path. That's called being a human being. No, I didn't bring sin and death into this world, but yes, I am the correction for it. No, I can't stop you from having to walk this path. I'm sorry it's difficult, but I'm not leaving you alone. That's the whole story mostly, right? And that's what they're faced with here. Now, I want to read you, I'm going to read you a short portion of this again, and then I want to try to play for you something that I never picked up on. And to me, it was well worth listening to, and it may take me a minute to get it set up. And it's about 20 minutes long, so it'll finish class. But when Peter walks on water, I've looked at this all my life, and I've looked at it from a particular way. Then Peter got out of the boat and was walking on water toward Jesus. But when Peter saw the strong wind, he became frightened and he began to sink. And he said, "Rescue me." And Jesus reached out his hand. Now, all my life I've read that Peter's faith had a blink, that the storms in life had caused him to blink. I've read it that way, and I've believed it that way, and I've heard it that way. Almost every example story in the Bible has more than one meaning. And I heard this meaning, and it hit home with me. And I'm going to see if I can get it to play where you can hear it. First, would be a mistake for me not to tell you who this is. This is a podcast called Bema, B-E-M-A, and Marty Sullivan is who does it. Marty Sullivan finished college in Christian ministry, became a Christian minister, and then became deeply involved in how the first century Jews lived. And so he's a Christian minister with a heavy involvement toward Jewish life. And the way he explains things in his podcast are from a Jewish perspective, which I quite frankly can't get. I can read it and understand what the words say, but I can't quite get it. This guy helps me get it because he does it from a Jewish perspective. So now that's not exactly going to come out as I play this, but I want you to know who he is. And they told me to try this, so let's see if y'all can hear it.
This is the Very Podcast with Marty Sullivan. I'm his co-host, Brent Billings. Today we have a little bit different episode for you. Marty interacts with the story of Peter walking in the water by sharing some of his thoughts, originally written years ago.
Yeah, so my daughter today, Abigail, she is 10 years old at the time of this recording. And when she was 2, so that'd be 8 years ago, I wrote a book, and then I wrote a book a few years later for my son. I just realized when I was a parent and I was watching my kids when they were really little, particularly as they got out of infancy and became toddlers, like I was seeing all of these things in my kids.
It is now.
I don't know if I know how to articulate it. I became profoundly aware of, I'm getting a glimpse of a perspective I've never had before in my life. And that's not a knock on single people or people that aren't able to have children or any of those things. I don't want that to be perceived that way. It was just me making observations about the life that I was experiencing. And out of that I wrote a book, and it's not a book for publication. I never wrote it to be published. Someday, Brett and I, we've chatted about, maybe I'll get it edited and proofread and have it in some form where people can get it for a donation or something like that. I don't know. Maybe someday. But today we don't have that. But I wrote this book just for my kids. I wrote a book for Abigail, and then I wrote a book for Ezekiel. Abigail's book was called When 2-Year-Olds Preach. And then Ezekiel's book was called When 5-Year-Olds Preach. And I took all the content of that book from that stage of their development. For Abigail, it was when she was kind of 0 to 2. And then Zeke, it was kind of from that 3 to 5 age range. And I wrote these books about observations that I was making. So one of those chapters, and of course you know me.
This is the Very Podcast with Marty Sullivan. I'm his co-host, Brent Billings. Today we have a little bit different episode for you. Marty interacts with the story of Peter walking in the water by sharing some of his thoughts, originally written years ago.
Yeah, so my daughter today, Abigail, she is 10 years old at the time of this recording. And when she was 2, so that'd be 8 years ago, I wrote a book, and then I wrote a book a few years later for my son. I just realized when I was a parent and I was watching my kids when they were really little, particularly as they got out of infancy and became toddlers. Like I was seeing all of these things in my kids that I don't even know if I know how to articulate it. I became profoundly aware of. I'm getting a glimpse of a perspective I've never had before in my life. And that's not a knock on single people or people that aren't able to have children or any of those things. I don't want that to be perceived that way. It was just me making observations about the life that I was experiencing. And out of that I wrote a book.
I know you can hear that. Is that too loud? No.
This is the Very Podcast with Marty Sullivan. I'm his co-host, Brent Billings. Today we have a little bit different episode for you. Marty interacts with the story of Peter walking in the water by sharing some of his thoughts, originally written years ago.
Yeah, so my daughter today, Abigail, she is 10 years old at the time of this recording. And when she was 2, so that'd be 8 years ago, I wrote a book, and then I wrote a book a few years later for my son. I just realized when I was a parent and I was watching my kids when they were really little, particularly as they got out of infancy and became toddlers, like I was seeing all of these things in my kids that I don't even know if I know how to articulate it. I became profoundly aware of. I'm getting a glimpse of a perspective I've never had before in my life. And that's not a knock on single people or people that aren't able to have children or any of those things. I don't want that to be perceived that way. It was just me making observations about the life that I was experiencing. And out of that I wrote a book, and it's not a book for publication. I never wrote it to be published. Someday, Brent and I, we've chatted about, maybe I'll get it edited and proofread and have it in some form where people can get it for a donation or something like that. I don't know. Maybe someday. But today we don't have that. But I wrote this book just for my kids. I wrote a book for Abigail, and then I wrote a book for Ezekiel. Abigail's book was called When 2-Year-Olds Preach. And then Ezekiel's book was called When 5-Year-Olds Preach. And I took all the content of that book from that stage of their development. For Abigail, it was when she was kind of 0 to 2. And then Zeke, it was kind of from that 3 to 5 age range. And I wrote these books about observations that I was making. So one of those chapters, and of course you know me, I intermixed. It wasn't just about watching my kids, it was about the Bible. So I was taking Bible lessons, kind of learning them through the lens of my children, and then writing about Bible lessons through the lessons I learned with my kids. So one of those was on the next story in Matthew, which is Peter walking on water. And I've just loved it. I have a hard time teaching on the story. That's really not true. But when I get an opportunity to teach and use the chapter that I wrote years ago, I love to share it that way. So that's what I'm going to do today. But we made a promise, Brent Billings.
Yeah, I think maybe just to set the stage,
Yes.
I should read the passage at hand, and then,
Perfect.
And then you can share your thoughts.
All right, sounds good.
So this is the end of Matthew 14. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him, and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed.
All right. So I'm going to read a chapter from this book. I'm just going to be reading, so sorry for the awkwardness, but be prepared for that. Wrote a chapter titled She Giggled. And here it is. I continue to be fascinated by Jesus' exhortation to have faith like a child. There is something about the nature of a child's understanding of his or her world that Jesus finds exemplary. It's hard for me, if I'm honest, to actually consider a child being an example of faith. At best, I thought of this lesson as cute, but certainly not packed with precious depth. And yet, I guess I've interacted with enough of Jesus' teachings to know better. As a Jewish rabbi teaching his disciples valuable and important lessons, I know that if a rabbi such as Jesus takes the time to set up a scenario and then uses it as a picture of spiritual formation, the listeners had better take note. Visible lessons from the rabbi are never intended to be empty or easy for that matter. In short, I need to stop treating that lesson as trivial or something that belongs on flannel graph. Part of my experience as a father, as I continue to make valuable observations, has been to notice how much profound depth there is to this very lesson. As the story goes on in one gospel, Jesus gathers the children around him. How long does this gathering and discussion take place? We're not told. I have always assumed that Jesus takes about 20 seconds to gather some kids up, looks at his disciples and other listeners and says, "Unless you have faith like a child, you cannot enter the kingdom." Then I have always imagined him ushering the children away so that he could proceed with his much more important, significant, and profound rabbinical teachings for the day. But after watching children at great length, I have begun to question my chronological assumptions. Perhaps this wasn't merely a 2-minute lesson that day. Perhaps it didn't resemble the silly children's sermon the pastor gives before the real message. Perhaps this teaching was much more profound than I had realized. Let me just suggest another possible scenario. Imagine Jesus and the disciples arose that morning, went out to their typical duties, gathered in the synagogue study room for morning readings, and left for the day's adventures. I picture maybe Matthew asking the question, "Rabbi, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" I picture Jesus pausing, silently gazing off into a nearby village, and without a word, marching off in the direction of the houses. Jesus arrives on the outskirts of the village and sees a whole host of children, 10 or 15 of them playing in a courtyard. He leads his disciples into the courtyard with the honored parents watching and welcoming him and his disciples, gracious to have such esteemed guests. The disciples, of course, are watching, paying attention to Jesus' every move as he scoops up a child and begins to playfully interact with the children. As a disciple, of course, your main duty is to mimic every move of your rabbi, and so you begin to engage the children in horseplay as well. I imagine Jesus and his disciples spending the day with the children, telling stories, playing games, maybe even taking naps. And as the day begins to come to a close, the family insists you stay for dinner. As you begin to recline in the shade of a nearby tree, Jesus speaks some of the first and only words he's spoken to you all day. Watch the children. You watch and you recline as you eat, and as the sun begins to set in the sky, Jesus calls one of the children over by name. He takes him and pulls him close under his arm, and he looks around at all of his disciples, making eye contact with all of them. I tell you the truth, Jesus says, unless you change and become like little children, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I have discovered there are great lessons to be learned from watching children. Not too long ago, Mom was at work. That's my wife, by the way, Mom. Was at work, and it was a nice day outside for a blustery winter in Idaho. It was just Dad and daughter, so I took her to a local park. In a rare moment for this control freak of a father, I decided I just wanted to let my daughter be. I wasn't going to assume that toys or swings were what her entertainment of choice would be for the day. I would watch her and keep her out of trouble, but I had this desire to see what she would do if she was left to be the captain of her own ship. She had just learned to walk. The whole experience of learning to walk was an incredible thing to behold as a parent. There are certain milestones you wait for in a newborn's life. The first time she rolls over, the first crawl, the first tooth, but there's nothing that compares to the ability of walking. There's the sheer panic the parent feels when their kid isn't walking as soon as their friend's kid is. You begin to question whether or not your child is going to be okay just a few weeks after all the other children are walking. It's an interesting thing, really. You don't obsess over teeth or weight like you do walking. And I can remember the joy of seeing my child learn to crawl or mutter her first words, but nothing compares to the pure thrill of those first 5 or 6 steps. It's an incredible high, a rush of adrenaline, and cheering with the look of bliss and joy covering your child's face. It's a look that says they are having the ride of their life in their own 2 legs for the first time. It's a look that says she is so happy to be the joy of her parents. It's a great look. But anyway, back to the park. She had just learned how to walk, and walking was, as they say, the cat's meow. She was on top of the world just walking around in the grass, and I was here only to watch, enjoy, and keep her from disappearing into a sprinkler hole. At one point in our afternoon, she walked off to the side of the park and down a very slight slope. I say slight from the perspective of someone who stands 6 foot 4 inches tall, not as a 1-year-old. I was actually quite impressed as she had not fallen face first on the way down the slope. Now, however, she had turned around and decided she was ready to make her ascent back up this hill. What I witnessed next was very simple. But what I witnessed next I will never forget as long as I live. This upward slope was a brand new experience for her. She had never encountered the physics of walking uphill. She attempted to take a step and immediately fell backward. The green grass was nice and long from a whole fall and winter season of no lawnmowers. She was unhurt. There was no need for Dad to step in. I could just continue to observe. She giggled. She got back up, which is not an easy process for a 1-year-old just learning to walk in the grass. She attempted to take a step. She fell. She got up. She attempted to take a step. She fell. She got up. She fell. She giggled. I expected to hear a cry or a whimper, but one never came. I expected to hear her whine and stretch out her hand to Dad for assistance, but she was just fine. She giggled. And she got up and she tried again and she fell. Without exaggerating, I can honestly say this process repeated itself a good 20 times before anything changed. Each and every time she got up, she stepped, she fell, and every now and again, she would giggle. At this point, she had begun to make some adjustments based on her newfound data in this one-year-old physics laboratory of sorts. She shifted her weight differently. She took her time. She placed her feet differently in relation to her body and the slope. She placed her feet, took a step, and took another step. She remained upright. She screamed a happy little girly scream. She took another step, and she fell. And she giggled. There is a story in the Gospels that we all know quite well. It's the story of Peter walking on the water. It's an amazing story that fascinates us to no end. Our Western minds are blown away as we consider the possibility of a man pursuing Jesus out onto the waves of the Sea of Galilee, performing such a miraculous feat to mirror that of his rabbi. It's almost too much for us to believe, and then just as we're beginning to become skeptical, Peter meets all of the worldly expectations and succumbs to the failure we've all been wishing he would defeat as our representative. He wavers, he fails, and he sinks. I've seen the look in too many people's eyes as they read that story. It's this look of hopeful disbelief followed by a "that's what I thought would happen" expression on their face. Even if they've read the story 1,000 times, I will sometimes see this expression or hear this tone. We then listen as Jesus scolds Peter's faith, while we all readily put ourselves into Peter's shoes and share his scolding, and we nod. But there's so much more taking place in this story. Much has been taught about the story already, so I don't want to be accused of plagiarizing anything. Ray Vanderlaan has an excellent treatment of this subject in That the World May Know, a series put out by Focus on the Family. It's actually in DVD 6, by the way, Brent, if we want to put that in the show notes. The lesson is called In the Dust of the Rabbi, and that series was published by Zondervan. Rob Bell, as well, treated the subject very well in Velvet Elvis, published by Zondervan in 2005. And another great and concise source of reference for this story can be found in his Numa video entitled Dust. I could not recommend these resources enough, and Rob had Ray as a teacher at one point, and all this material has been shared amongst us, so I don't want to plagiarize any of that stuff. Back to my reading. The first century concept of discipleship was such that the most successful thing you could do in the Jewish culture, the thing they valued the most, was the study of Torah. One of the pinnacle experiences of the Jewish school system was being given the opportunity to become a Talmid, or as we say it, a disciple. If you thought you had what it takes as a student of the Torah, you would apply for discipleship under a rabbi. One of the greatest honors a boy could receive would be the acceptance of a rabbi to be his Talmid. If a rabbi chose you as a disciple, he was in essence saying to you, I believe you have what it takes to become just like me. It was a great honor. So the path of a disciple was a path of memorizing the rabbi's teachings, taking on the rabbi's set of interpretations, and, most importantly, becoming just like the rabbi. This meant that you spent all day, every day, trying to mimic the thoughts, actions, and teachings of your teacher. Some Jewish scholars say that they have seen a rabbi proceed into a restroom. I actually have a friend that says he saw this in an airport. And in his wake are 10 or 12 young disciples. You want to be just like your rabbi. If your rabbi does it, you do it. And you know that you can do it because if you could not have done it, the rabbi would have never called you. The rabbi's call is his affirmation in your ability and your potential. Peter finds himself in a boat that night with the other disciples, and they end up encountering Jesus, who happens to be walking on the water. If Jesus is walking on the water, what does Peter want to do? He wants to be just like his rabbi. Lord, if it's really you, call me out to you on the water. Come. And Peter does. He walks on the water. It's an incredible story. Peter is a true disciple. And then Peter sinks. But why does Peter sink? The answer for many of us is that Peter loses faith. He sees the wind and the waves and he loses faith. That is correct. But as Bell asks, whom does he lose faith in? Jesus? Jesus is not sinking. Jesus is doing just fine. Does Peter lose faith in Jesus' ability to help him walk on water? Or does Peter lose faith in himself? Jesus rescues Peter, pulls him into the boat, and then asks, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Is this actually a rabbinical scolding of Peter's failure to accomplish his task? Or is this question of Jesus actually driving at his belief in Peter? Peter, if you didn't have what it takes to walk on water, I never would have called you out. If you have everything you need to do this. I believe in you, Peter. You can do whatever I call you to do. I will never ask you to do something you cannot do. Listen to what Rob Bell says in Velvet Elvis. So at the end of his time with his disciples, Jesus had some final words for them. He tells them to go to the ends of the earth and make more disciples, and then he leaves. He promises to send his Spirit to guide them and give them power, but Jesus himself leaves the future of the movement in their hands. And he doesn't stick around to make sure they don't screw it up. He's gone. He trusts that they can actually do it. God has an incredibly high view of people. God believes that people are capable of amazing things. I have been told that I need to believe in Jesus, which is a good thing. But what I'm learning is that Jesus believes in me. I have been told that I need to have faith in God, which is a good thing. But what I'm learning is that God has faith in me. The rabbi thinks we can be like him. End quote. I often watch my children and wonder when it was that I lost faith in myself. I'm not talking about a narcissistic faith that seems to elevate my standing in God's created order and lacks humility. I'm certainly not trying to promote some humanistic worldview that seems to assert that the answer to all of our ills somehow lies within us. I truly and earnestly believe that the hope for all of this world's brokenness lies in the power of the resurrected Christ and the reality of Jesus. But I'm talking about faith in myself that recognizes that I'm made in the image of God. The kind of faith that might actually be willing to believe there must be something worth loving and worth saving if God was willing to save it through the story of the cross. I wonder, as I watch my children, how it was that my innocence was somehow connected with my confidence. Boy, there's another chapter or two just waiting to be written there, isn't there? Jesus tells me that if I were to watch children for a little while, it would probably do me some good. That if I cannot change and become like little children, the kingdom will be out of my reach. One of the things that I'm noticing about children is they have incredible faith in themselves. They know that dad is there, and they know that mom is there, and they know they are loved, and they just want to play and smile and laugh and tumble. It seems like later on in life, we begin to question all of those things. Is dad really there for me? Am I really worth loving? Can I really do this? And we try to do the things we know in our hearts we were created to do. We step out of the boat and we begin to walk, but we know the wind and the waves are out there somewhere, just waiting to sabotage our one fleeting moment of weak courage. We try and we sink. And we're not surprised, really, are we? We knew it would happen just like this. There's no way we could ever walk on water. So we grab for our life preserver, we climb back into the boat, and we hold our gaze on the floor as we take the scolding that we knew we had coming. Oh, me of little faith. Oh, me, the big doubter. It's just another failed attempt to live out what God intends for my life. When will I ever learn? I should just get used to this and stay in the boat next time. It will save me the humiliation and the pain and the failure. It's much safer and nicer here in the boat. Yeah, next time I won't be so silly. I picture Jesus grabbing me by the chin and jerking my head up, waiting for my gaze to meet his. And with a divine sparkle in his eye, he looks into my soul, the soul he knows intimately because he personally knit it together, and he says to me, "You can do this." I go back in my mind and remember my daughter on that slope. 20 times. 30 times. 10 minutes later, we have finally traversed the 12 feet that leads to the top of that slope. And she laughs, and she giggles, and she prances and waddles along the now level ground, and she is thrilled to be at the top and to run and play with ease. Of course, she was happy to be at the bottom of the slope, too. I've come to a new realization. I want to learn how to giggle. I would never suggest...
Thank you. I'm sorry we went 3 or 4 minutes over. When I took this off a while ago, I pulled both hearing aids out. So I'm walking around trying to decide if y'all can't hear, because I can't hear. Thanks for coming.